Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, grateful for your company on a night such as this. Tell me, is there snow beyond your window, or perhaps the memory of it? There is something in a sealed and silent house that strips away pretense, leaving only what is true. Watson understood this well. When all roads are closed and the world grows still, careful observation becomes the only key that opens anything at all. Do subscribe so these quiet investigations are never far from reach. Now, settle in. For as the snow begins to melt, only sequence reveals the truth. You will find Watson's Margins on Spotify too. The link is in the description below. Chapter 1. Snow at Blackthorn Hall. It is not often that I look back upon a particular winter and feel the cold of it still, as though the season had pressed itself into memory, with the same insistence it pressed against the window panes of Blackthorn Hall. That January was of the kind which descends upon the north of England, not as a gradual diminishing of warmth, but as a sudden and absolute pronouncement, as if the land itself had been served notice. The roads into Northumberland hardened, the sky closed to the colour of pewter, and before Holmes and I had been 3 hours upon our journey from Baker Street, the world outside the railway carriage had become a white and featureless silence. We had been summoned, if that word is not too strong, by a letter from Sir Julian Mercer, a retired magistrate of considerable standing in the county, and a man whose name I had encountered, once or twice, in the pages of the legal press. The letter was precise and dignified in its phrasing, as one might expect from a man who had spent the better part of 4 decades administering justice in a district where the law was not always welcomed. He wrote that he had come into possession of certain documents relating to a concluded legal matter, and that the documents had given him cause for unease. He did not elaborate. He asked only whether Mr. Sherlock Holmes might find it convenient to spend several days at Blackthorn Hall, as a guest rather than an investigator, until the nature of his concerns could be better established. Holmes had read the letter twice, set it on the breakfast table, and announced that we would take the 10 o'clock to Darlington. I had thought little of it at the time. Holmes accepted perhaps one invitation in 12 that arrived by post, and his reasons for acceptance were seldom obvious until considerably later. He offered no explanation during the journey north, beyond remarking once, as the first snow began to appear at the margins of the fields, that a retired magistrate who wrote with precision, but asked imprecisely, was a man who knew more than he was prepared to commit to paper. Blackthorn Hall proved to be a substantial house of grey stone, set upon a low rise above a valley floor, with a long carriage drive flanked by leafless oaks that stood in the snow like figures in attitudes of resignation. The house itself was not grand in the manner of the southern estates I had occasionally visited, but it had a solidity about it, a sense of having endured several centuries without unnecessary modification, which I found both impressive and faintly oppressive. A manservant met us at the door, took our bags with silent efficiency, and led us through a wide entrance hall hung with portraits of men in the dress of other centuries, all of them looking down with the same expression of careful reserve that distinguished their living descendant. Sir Julian Mercer was waiting in the drawing-room. He was a tall man of 70 or thereabouts, thin without appearing frail, with white hair combed back from a broad forehead and eyes of a pale, clear grey, that had the quality I've sometimes noticed in experienced barristers. They observed without appearing to look. He shook Holmes's hand with measured warmth and mine with genuine courtesy, and then drew us toward the fire, where the other occupants of the house were gathered with the particular mixture of animation and constraint that attends a group of people who are still in the process of taking one another's measure. He introduced them in turn, and I made what notes I could. Dr. Edwin Fawcett was the district coroner, a compact man in his mid-50s with close-cropped grey whiskers and the careful manner of a professional who has learned to present conclusions without revealing the process of their formation. He greeted Holmes with rather more composure than most men manage on a first meeting, which I noted as either confidence or an abundance of caution. Mr. Lionel Graves was a solicitor, perhaps 10 years younger than Fawcett, and possessed of knees about him that might, in another man, have been called charm, and in him produced the faint impression of something rather too smoothly applied. He wore his clothes well and spoke with a precision that was not quite elegance. Miss Eleanor Mercer was Sir Julian's niece, a woman of perhaps 30, with dark eyes and an expression that suggested intelligence held in check by habit. She received us with composure, though I thought I detected behind that composure the remnant of some recent agitation. Captain Richard Vale was immediately identifiable as a military man, though he was now some years from active service. He was broad-shouldered and direct in his manner, with a kind of physical stillness that comes from long practice in environments where unnecessary movement invites consequence. He and Holmes shook hands without ceremony, two men apparently content to defer judgment. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore was a widow of comfortable means, I surmised, dressed with the understated quality that speaks of old money rather than recent acquisition. She was perhaps 60, pleasant in manner, and possessed of a precise social intelligence that expressed itself in small, well-timed observations. Mr. Philip Hurst completed the party. He was Sir Julian's secretary, a young man of 28 or so, with a thin, earnest face, and the slightly worn appearance of someone who works harder than his position requires. He greeted us with a deference that was not civility, and I liked him immediately. The storm which had been threatening since mid-afternoon arrived before dinner. I heard it first as a change in the quality of the silence beyond the windows, and then as a sound, low and insistent, that built over the course of an hour into something that made the old house creak and settle. By the time we sat down to eat, the snow was driving horizontally past the dining-room windows, and the butler confirmed, with the measured regret of a man who has seen this before, that the roads to the nearest town were already impassable. The company received this news with the variety of responses it generally produces: resignation from those who had hoped to leave, a kind of satisfaction from those who had not, and careful neutrality from those, like Holmes, who found the situation useful. Our host made light of it, observed that the cellars were well stocked and the library extensive, and proposed that we should be comfortable until the weather relented. Through dinner, the conversation turned on the usual subjects available to stranded guests: the landscape in other seasons, the history of the house, the relative merits of various county towns. Holmes ate with the distracted efficiency of a man whose attention is elsewhere, and I observed him, as I've so often done, conducting his own quiet investigations across the candle-lit table. His gaze moved from face to face with an unhurried patience that, to those who did not know him, must have appeared merely contemplative. It was after the soup was removed that Sir Julian, with the air of a man introducing a topic he has carefully selected, mentioned that the snow always reminded him of an inquest held the previous March, when a similar storm had delayed proceedings for 2 days. He said it mildly, as a man makes casual conversation, and looked at nothing in particular. The effect upon the table was not dramatic. It was rather what Holmes has described to me as the effect of a key being turned very slightly in a lock. Nothing opens, but everything shifts. Dr. Fawcett reached for his wine. Mr. Hurst set down his fork. Captain Vale, who had been speaking to Miss Mercer, paused almost imperceptibly before continuing his sentence. Sir Julian noted none of this, or gave no sign of doing so. Holmes noted all of it. As the meal concluded and the company moved toward the drawing-room, Holmes fell into step beside me and murmured, in that tone he uses when he is recording rather than communicating, that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they have nowhere to go. He glanced toward the snow-obscured windows. "We're isolated, Watson," he said pleasantly, "and isolation is, in my experience, the most honest of all conditions." I didn't know then precisely what he meant. I was to understand it considerably better before the week was out. Chapter 2. The Matter of the Old Inquest. The morning after our arrival brought no improvement in the weather. I rose early, as is my habit, and stood at the window of my room long enough to confirm what I had already suspected. The snow had continued through the night and lay now against the lower portions of the garden walls to a depth which made any thought of departure faintly absurd. The oaks along the carriage drive had disappeared to their upper branches. The world beyond Blackthorn Hall had ceased, for practical purposes, to exist. Breakfast was served at 8, and the company assembled gradually, in the manner of people who are not yet sufficiently acquainted to time their appearances to one another. Holmes was already at the table when I descended, working through a plate of toast with the absent mechanical efficiency of a man whose mind is occupied elsewhere. He had, I noticed, positioned himself at the corner of the table nearest the window, from which he commanded a view of both the garden and the doorway. It was the kind of arrangement that, in a room occupied by strangers, I had come to recognise as deliberate. The conversation at breakfast was of the storm. Captain Vale had walked the length of the downstairs corridor before dawn, and reported that a drift had formed against the east wall which he estimated at 6 feet. Mrs. Whitmore observed, with the measured pleasantness of a woman accustomed to making difficult situations agreeable, that the library was exceptionally well stocked, and that she had already selected 3 volumes. Dr. Fawcett spoke very little, confining himself to brief replies and the systematic consumption of his eggs. Miss Mercer poured tea for those within reach of the pot and said nothing at all, though she listened to everything. It was Hurst who first brought some practical order to the morning, producing a small notebook from his coat pocket, and confirming with Sir Julian which household arrangements required attention. The two of them spoke quietly at the far end of the table, and I observed the easy familiarity between employer and secretary, the kind that accumulates over years of mutual reliance. Whatever unease I had detected in Hurst the previous evening had resolved itself, by daylight, into the composed attentiveness of a capable young man at his work. Holmes watched all of this without appearing to watch any of it. After breakfast the party dispersed. Holmes announced his intention to examine the library and invited me to join him. In practice, this meant that he stood before the shelves for approximately 4 minutes, selected 2 volumes which he did not open, and then settled into the chair nearest the fire and closed his eyes. I have learned, over the years, not to mistake this for sleep. It was not until luncheon that the substance of our visit began to emerge. Sir Julian had arranged the table so that conversation flowed naturally, and it was during the second course, without any appearance of contrivance, that he raised the subject which had brought us north. He spoke of a local landowner named Nathaniel Crowe, who had died the previous spring. Crowe had owned a considerable parcel of land in the valley below Blackthorn Hall, and his death, which had occurred in circumstances sufficiently ambiguous to require a formal inquiry, had been the subject of an inquest conducted by Dr. Fawcett the following March. The verdict, arrived at after 2 days of proceedings, was accidental death. The matter had been closed, the estate settled, and Crowe's land sold to satisfy certain debts. This, Sir Julian said, lifting his glass with a mildness that I recognised as the particular mildness of a man who is not mild at all, was the established account of events. He paused and set his glass down. He then mentioned, as though it were a minor curiosity rather than the point toward which everything else had been directed, that he had received, some 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous letter. The letter was brief. It stated only that the inquest into Nathaniel Crowe's death had not arrived at the truth, and that those who had administered it were aware of this. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. At a smaller table it might have passed unnoticed. At this one, among this company, it had the quality of a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Graves was the first to speak. He said, with a light laugh, that anonymous letters were the resort of cowards and the entertainment of idle minds, and that any solicitor of experience could confirm they were rarely worth the paper on which they were written. Mrs. Whitmore agreed, pleasantly. Captain Vale said nothing, but raised his wine and drank. Dr. Fawcett set down his fork. It was a small gesture. The fork met the plate with a precision that suggested deliberate care rather than natural movement, and Fawcett followed it by folding his napkin with the same unhurried attention. He then said, in a measured tone, that he had conducted the inquest in question to the full satisfaction of the court, and in complete accordance with the evidence available. He said it the way a man repeats a thing he has said before to himself in the small hours. Hurst, beside me, had gone very still. He did not look at Fawcett, nor at Sir Julian, nor at Holmes. He looked at his plate. Captain Vale, who had been rearranging the salt cellar with one broad finger, abruptly asked Mrs. Whitmore whether she had visited Northumberland before, and the conversation lurched, with visible relief among certain of its participants, towards safer ground. Holmes ate his soup. Later that afternoon, as the light began to fail and the company settled into the loose domesticity of a snowbound evening, Sir Julian drew Holmes and me into his study. It was a room of considerable character. 3 walls given over almost entirely to books, a large desk of scarred mahogany, and a pair of chairs positioned before a fire that had been burning by the look of the grate since early morning. He closed the door with care. He told us then what the letter had caused him to do. He had returned, with the methodical instinct of a man who had spent his career in the law, to the original records of the Crow inquest. He had obtained copies of the relevant documents through a contact at the county court, and he had spent several evenings examining them. What he had found, or rather what he had not found, had alarmed him. The inquest had proceeded with unusual speed. Certain witness statements which he would have expected to appear in the record were absent. The medical testimony was present in summary only, without the supporting notes that standard practice required Fawcett to retain. And there was one additional matter which Sir Julian mentioned last, and with the care of a man placing a particularly fragile object upon a table. The original verdict form, which should have been sealed and retained by the court, appeared to have been substituted. The document on file was in the correct form and bore the correct signatures, but the paper itself, he believed, was newer than the date it carried. He looked at Holmes steadily. Holmes, who had said nothing during this account, asked a single question. "Have you retained the documents you obtained, Sir Julian?" "I have," said Sir Julian. "They are in the locked drawer of this desk." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already settled. He rose, thanked our host for his candour, and remarked that the evening was growing late. At the door he paused. "One thing more," he said. "I would be grateful if you would say nothing further to any member of this household about what you have just told us. Nothing at all." Sir Julian agreed. We returned to the drawing-room, where a card game was in progress, and the fire had been built high against the cold. Holmes declined to play. He sat apart from the others with a book open on his knee and his eyes, as I knew, on the room. I slept badly that night. The snow pressed its silence against the windows, and somewhere in the early hours I heard, or believed I heard, a sound in the corridor outside my room, a single footstep, careful and deliberate, and then nothing. I lay still and listened for a long time, but it did not come again. In the morning, Sir Julian Mercer was dead. Chapter 3. A Death Behind Locked Doors. I have attended, in the course of a long association with Sherlock Holmes, a number of scenes which the word discovery fails adequately to describe. There is a particular quality to the moment when a door is opened upon something that cannot be undone, a quality compounded of stillness and irreversibility, and it was present in full measure when Hurst appeared at the door of my room at 7:30 that morning, with a face from which all his characteristic composure had been erased entirely. He said only that Sir Julian could not be roused, and that the study door was locked from within. I was dressed and in the corridor in under a minute. Holmes emerged from his own room simultaneously, which suggested he had not been asleep. He carried nothing, asked nothing, and moved toward the study at the far end of the east wing with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already begun to work. The study door was, as Hurst had said, firmly locked. Holmes knelt briefly and examined the keyhole, then straightened and stood back. He asked Hurst whether the household possessed a duplicate key. Hurst produced one from a board in the butler's pantry within 3 minutes, and when the lock turned and the door swung inward, the smell of cold air and extinguished candle reached us before anything else. Sir Julian lay upon the turkey carpet before his desk, not in the attitude of a man who had fallen, but in the composed stillness of one who had been lowered slowly toward the floor. He was in his dressing gown and slippers, which indicated he had returned to the study after the household had retired. His face was turned slightly to one side. His right hand lay open, palm upward, upon the carpet beside him. There was no blood, no sign of disturbance in the conventional sense, and Dr. Fawcett, who had appeared at the doorway behind us, moved forward, knelt, and after a brief examination announced what the stillness of the room had already implied, that Sir Julian had been dead for several hours and that the apparent cause was failure of the heart. Holmes listened to this without comment. He had already moved to the window. The window was latched from within, and the snow upon the outside sill lay in an unbroken plain, smooth and unmarked. Beyond it, the garden was a white uniformity upon which nothing had walked since the storm ceased in the early hours. Holmes examined the latch, the lower frame, and the exterior sill as closely as the glass permitted, then turned back to the room. He did not, as I had half expected, immediately begin upon the desk or the body. He stood for a moment in the centre of the room and looked at the ceiling, which is a habit I have never satisfactorily explained and which invariably precedes his most productive observations. Then he looked at the fire, which had burned down to cold ash, and then at the floor between the door and the desk. A chair, one of the two positioned before the fireplace, had been moved. It stood now at an angle that placed it neither before the fire nor before the desk, but at an oblique point between them that served no obvious purpose. The casters had left faint impressions in the carpet at their current position, and fainter ones partially overlapping at a point some 18 inches to the left. Holmes crouched beside the nearer set of impressions and examined them without touching anything. On the desk itself lay a sheaf of papers. Uppermost among them, and lying at a slight angle to the rest, as though it had been set down in haste or examined most recently, was a document I recognised from Sir Julian's description the previous evening, the copy of the inquest verdict concerning the death of Nathaniel Crowe. It was a single sheet closely printed in the formal manner of court documents, bearing at its foot a signature above the printed name of Dr. Edwin Fawcett, coroner. Holmes stood over it for rather a long time. He did not touch it. There was a candlestick on the corner of the desk, fitted with the stub of a candle that had burned entirely away. Beside it, on the leather surface, was a small ring of wax, hardened and pale at a point roughly 8 inches from where the candlestick stood. Holmes produced his lens and examined this ring with minute attention, then straightened and looked across the room toward the mantelpiece clock. The clock had stopped. Its hands indicated 20 minutes past 11. Holmes asked Hurst, who was still standing in the doorway, at what time the household had generally retired the previous evening. Hurst said that the drawing room had been vacated shortly before 10 o'clock, and that he himself had been the last to go upstairs at 15:15. Holmes thanked him, then asked him to ensure that no one else entered the study and to send word to the local police. Hurst withdrew. Holmes turned to me. "Your medical opinion, Watson, cause of death." I had already made my own examination of Sir Julian, and, setting aside the respect I owed to a man I had known only briefly but found entirely admirable, I gave it as carefully as I could. The presentation was consistent with cardiac failure. The posture, the absence of any cyanosis about the lips, the relaxed attitude of the limbs, all of it argued for a sudden and not prolonged end. I estimated death at somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. "And yet," Holmes said, not quite as a question. I had not mentioned the one detail which had given me pause, and I was not entirely surprised that he had perceived my hesitation. The position of the body, I said, was not precisely what one would expect from a man who had collapsed while standing. There was a quality to the arrangement of the limbs which suggested, faintly but persistently, that Sir Julian had been, at some point very close to the moment of his death, seated rather than upright. Holmes nodded with the brief satisfaction of a man who has received confirmation rather than information. Inspector Mallory of the County Constabulary arrived within 2 hours, a broad, deliberate man in a heavy coat who smelled of pipe tobacco and cold air, and who brought with him a constable, a notebook, and the settled conviction that country house deaths, when they occur in winter among respectable people, are nearly always what they appear. He examined the room, took statements from the household, consulted with Fawcett, and reached his provisional conclusion with a speed that Holmes observed from the corner of the room without expression. Mallory's view was that Sir Julian, a man of 70 with a history of cardiac irregularity, had returned to his study after the household retired to review the legal papers with which he had lately been occupied, and had suffered a fatal episode while doing so. The locked door and undisturbed snow confirmed that no one else had been present. It was a melancholy business, but not, he indicated, a complicated one. Holmes said nothing to contradict this. He asked only one question of Mallory, in a tone of mild inquiry. Whether the inspector had noted the position of the clock. Mallory had noted it. He said that Sir Julian had likely stopped it himself, as elderly men sometimes did before retiring, to silence the mechanism. Holmes said that this was certainly one explanation, and thanked the inspector for his time. Later, as we stood in the corridor while Mallory's constable completed his notes, Holmes spoke to me in a low voice, with the particular quality of precision he reserved for observations he wished me to retain exactly. 3 things, Watson. The clock stopped at 11:20, yet Hurst did not retire until 10:15, and he heard Sir Julian moving in the corridor at some point afterward. A detail he mentioned and does not yet know is significant. The wax ring on the desk was left by a candle held in the hand, not one standing in a holder, and the inquest document, which Sir Julian kept in a locked drawer, is lying on top of a sheaf of papers into which it has not been inserted. It was placed there, not found there. He said nothing more for a long moment. Someone, he added at last, has been in this room. The snow and the lock were meant to persuade us otherwise. I am not persuaded. Chapter 4. The Impossible Circumstances. Inspector Mallory was not, I should say in fairness, a man who dismissed inconvenient observations. He was rather a man who arranged them into the shape of what he already believed, which is a different failing, and in some respects a more dangerous one. When Holmes raised the matter of the clock the following morning, Mallory listened with the attentiveness of a professional, and then explained patiently why it confirmed his existing conclusion rather than complicating it. I have encountered this quality in a number of otherwise capable men, and I have noticed that Holmes finds it neither surprising nor particularly frustrating. He simply adjusts his approach. The household had gathered in the drawing room at Mallory's request. The atmosphere was unlike anything I had previously witnessed in that space. The fire burned, the chairs were occupied in roughly their usual arrangement, and yet the room had acquired overnight the quality of a place in which something permanent had changed. Miss Mercer sat very straight and looked at her hands. Mrs. Whitmore had brought her needlework and was not using it. Captain Vale stood near the window with his arms folded, watching the snow, which had begun again, lightly, in the early morning. Mallory addressed the group with a combination of gravity and practicality that the situation demanded, confirmed that Sir Julian's death appeared to be of natural causes, and stated that he would nonetheless require statements from each person regarding the previous evening. This was received with the composed cooperation of people who understand that refusal invites attention. Holmes sat apart and said nothing. I have learned to read something in his silences. There are silences that indicate patience and silences that indicate absorption, and this was the latter. His gaze moved across the room with the methodical unhurriedness of a man cataloguing rather than observing. The statements, taken individually in the dining room, produced no material contradictions. Each person had retired between 9:30 and 10:15. Each had slept through the night, or claimed to have done so. No one had heard anything unusual. The corridor outside the study had been, by universal agreement, unvisited. Mallory assembled these accounts with evident satisfaction. They were consistent, they were plausible, and they eliminated entirely the possibility of external intrusion. The roads were impassable, the snow was undisturbed, the door had been locked from within. He told me privately during a brief interval, satisfied that no third party was involved and that the death would be recorded accordingly. Holmes had by this point returned to the study, having obtained Mallory's permission with a brevity that suggested he had not seriously entertained the possibility of refusal. I followed him and found him at work in the systematic manner I knew well, beginning at the periphery of the room and moving inward, disturbing nothing, recording everything, with the lens appearing and disappearing from his waistcoat pocket at intervals of perhaps 30 seconds. He had been at this for perhaps a quarter of an hour when he stopped beside the fireplace and remained still for long enough that I felt compelled to ask what he had found. What I expected to find, he said, and what I expected not to find. The two are equally instructive. He directed my attention to the ash in the grate. The fire had been built and had burned for several hours, which was consistent with a man who had settled in for an extended evening's work. But the quantity of ash, Holmes observed, and the distribution of unconsumed fragments at the rear of the grate indicated that the fire had been built upon an existing bed and had burned not from the standard hour of lighting in the evening, but from a point somewhat earlier in the day. This was not in itself conclusive, but it meant that Sir Julian, if he had indeed been in the study for the last hours of his life, had occupied a room which was already warm when he arrived. Holmes then stood before the desk and directed my attention to the sheaf of papers. They were arranged, he said, as a man arranges papers when he is examining them in sequence, each sheet lifted, read, and replaced below. The inquest document was uppermost, as though it had been the last thing examined, or the first thing found. But the document itself bore a fold across its upper third, a crisp, recent fold of the kind produced when a paper is slipped quickly into a pocket or a drawer, and then unfolded again in haste. Sir Julian told us he kept that document in the locked desk drawer, I said. He did, Holmes agreed, and yet it carries a fold it would not have acquired in a drawer. Drawers are flat, pockets are not. He turned to the body's final resting position, which the constable had sketched in his notebook and Holmes had studied from the doorway. He now stood at the precise point on the carpet where Sir Julian had been found, and looked across the desk. From this position, he said, a man standing upright would see the surface of the desk at roughly this angle. He extended his hand to indicate, but the lamp on the desk had been angled upward, Watson. Not for a man standing before it, for a man seated behind it. I followed this reasoning to its implication. You believe someone else was seated at the desk? I believe the lamp angle is inconsistent with Sir Julian's height, and with the position in which he was found. I believe the chair at the oblique angle between fire and desk was placed there by someone other than Sir Julian, and I believe the candle wax on the desk surface was deposited by a hand that held the candle low, over the papers, as one holds a light when reading by it in a room whose lamp has already been extinguished. He paused. The lamp, incidentally, was extinguished, not burned out. The wick had been pinched, not exhausted. I considered this arrangement of facts with the discomfort of a man who has been persuaded by an argument he cannot yet fully follow. Mallory's account was simpler, and simplicity has its own considerable persuasiveness. Yet the details Holmes had identified were not interpretations. They were facts, and they did not fit the simple account. But the door, I said, locked from within. Holmes looked at the lock with the expression he occasionally produces when a problem has already been solved and the solution is waiting to be spoken aloud. The lock, he said, is of the standard mortise type. The key was found inside the room, on the desk, not in the lock, Watson, on the desk. I confess that I had not noticed this. Most people do not, he said, without unkindness. A key found in a lock suggests it was turned and withdrawn by someone departing. A key found on a desk suggests it was set down by someone inside. The question is whether it was set down before or after the door was locked, and from which side the locking occurred. I began to speak, and Holmes raised one hand. Not yet. There is one further matter which Mallory has not yet considered, and which I should like to confirm before this afternoon. The document on the desk is a copy, Watson. Sir Julian said so himself. He obtained copies through a contact at the county court. The original verdict remains with the court, but this copy has been handled very recently and by more than one pair of hands. The thumb impression on the lower left margin is not, I think, Sir Julian's. He said it quietly and without drama, and then he walked to the window and looked out at the white still garden, as though the case were a matter to be considered at some distance. Outside, the snow was settling again, and the grounds of Blackthorn Hall lay sealed and silent, hiding whatever the night had deposited within them. Chapter 5. What the Eyes Reveal. The afternoon of the second day brought a change in the quality of the household silence. In the immediate hours following the discovery of Sir Julian's death, the silence had been of the stunned variety, soft and bewildered. By mid-afternoon, it had sharpened into something more guarded. People spoke less and watched more, and the watching had acquired a lateral quality, each person attending behind the appearance of ordinary grief to what the others were doing and saying, and, perhaps more particularly, to what they were not. Holmes noticed this with what I can only describe as a quiet professional satisfaction, as a naturalist might regard the behaviour of a disturbed colony. He remarked to me, as we walked the length of the downstairs corridor before luncheon, that a group of people with a shared secret under pressure does not unravel all at once but by degrees, and that the degrees were already visible to anyone who knew where to look. He began his individual conversations that afternoon. I use the word conversations rather than interviews, because they bore no resemblance to the latter. There was no formality, no announced purpose, no suggestion of examination. Holmes moved from person to person with the unhurried sociability of a man who finds all human beings of roughly equal interest, which is not, I should say, an accurate description of his actual feelings. He asked about Sir Julian's manner in recent weeks, about the running of the estate, about the habits of the household. The questions were mild and apparently random. Their targets were not random at all. I was present for several of these exchanges and absent for others. What I observed I shall set down in the order in which it registered its significance upon me, which was not always the order in which it occurred. Captain Vale received Holmes in the small sitting-room adjacent to the library. He was standing when we entered and remained standing, which is the disposition of a man who prefers not to be looked down upon. The conversation began with the captain's connection to Sir Julian. They had known one another for 15 years, since a period when Vale had served as Justice's assistant in a temporary capacity, and moved, by what appeared to be natural gradation, toward Nathaniel Crowe. Vale had known Crowe, it emerged. They had been members of the same sporting association some years before Crowe's death. He spoke of Crowe with the careful neutrality of a man describing someone he has decided not to speak of at all. Holmes, during this exchange, said very little. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin resting upon his linked fingers, and he looked at a point slightly below Vale's left knee. I looked at the same point eventually, and observed what Holmes had already seen. A fresh scratch across the upper leather of the captain's boot, not the accumulated wear of outdoor use, but a single clean mark, curved and recent, of the kind produced by contact with a metal edge. It was on the inner side of the left boot and would not have been visible when Vale was seated. Holmes thanked him, and we moved on. Mr. Hurst was found in the estate office, a narrow room beside the kitchen passage which Sir Julian had fitted out for his secretary's use, and where Hurst had retreated, I suspected, less from a desire to work than from a desire for a room with a closed door. He rose when we entered with the air of a man who's been expecting something for some time, and has resolved to receive it composedly. Holmes sat on the edge of the office table without invitation, which produced in Hurst the slight recalibration that an unexpected informality always achieves. He asked Hurst how long he'd been in Sir Julian's employ. 4 years, Hurst said. Holmes asked whether, in those 4 years, Sir Julian had ever previously shown concern about a legal matter of a private nature. Hurst considered this with visible honesty, and said that Sir Julian had always been conscientious about legal irregularities of any kind, whether they affected him personally or not. It was, Hurst said, simply how he was made. Holmes asked one further question, in the same mild tone that had carried all the others. Had Hurst been outside that morning before the household arose? Hurst said he had not. Holmes thanked him and rose from the table. At the door he paused, in the manner which I had come to recognise as anything but accidental, and looked at the sleeve of Hurst's jacket, which lay folded over the back of the chair. There was a faint dampness along the lower portion of the left sleeve, and caught in the weave of the wool just above the cuff, several fibres of a grey, coarse character inconsistent with the dark broadcloth of the jacket itself. The kind of fibre, I thought, produced by contact with a heavy outdoor garment, or perhaps with rope. Hurst's gaze followed Holmes's to the sleeve, and something moved very quickly behind his eyes and was replaced by composure. Mrs. Whitmore was the most immediately forthcoming of all the persons Holmes spoke with that afternoon, in the sense that she spoke a great deal, and with apparent openness, and said rather less than any of them. She had come to Blackthorn Hall, she explained, at Sir Julian's particular invitation, as she'd known him socially for many years and had, in a private capacity, assisted with certain charitable arrangements that Sir Julian administered as a trustee. Holmes asked with gentle interest what charities these were. Mrs. Whitmore named two. One a local almshouse, the other a small fund established for the education of miners' children in the western part of the county. Holmes listened with every appearance of being entirely satisfied by this answer. I noticed that the glove on Mrs. Whitmore's left hand was worn rather than held, indoors, which is not the usual custom. Holmes noticed it rather earlier than I did. When she set down her teacup and the glove shifted, there was visible at the wrist for perhaps 2 seconds the edge of a bruise of the yellowed fading variety that speaks of an injury sustained some 5 or 6 days previously. She resettled the glove without apparent self-consciousness, and the conversation moved elsewhere. Dr. Fawcett declined, not rudely, to be drawn into conversation with Holmes at all. He was civil, responsive to direct questions, and entirely successful in ensuring that none of Holmes's approaches established themselves as conversations. He stood near the window of whichever room he occupied, answered in short, composed sentences, and volunteered nothing. When Holmes remarked, almost in passing, that the inquest into Crow's death must have been a demanding undertaking for a district coroner working alone, Fawcett said only that all inquests were demanding, and that the law required nothing less than one's complete attention. He then mentioned that he had letters to write and excused himself. Holmes watched him go with an expression I have seen before. Not frustration, but the particular quality of attention a man gives to a door that has just been closed. He said nothing until we had walked to the end of the corridor and turned into the passage that led toward the main hall. Then he stopped and looked out at the clock tower that rose from the eastern end of the stable block, visible through a narrow window. Miss Mercer, I recalled from the first evening, had glanced toward it more than once at dinner. "Fawcett has written nothing this morning," Holmes said. "The ink on his cuffs is from yesterday or before. He has been in this house for 2 days and claims to have conducted no paperwork. A coroner who came prepared for a country visit." He paused. "And yet the ink is quite definitely there." He looked at the clock tower a moment longer. "People lie with words," he said, "but seldom with habits. The habit of concealment, Watson, is itself a kind of confession. One need only determine what it is that is being concealed." He turned from the window and walked on, and I followed, carrying with me the accumulated impressions of the afternoon like a collection of objects, whose arrangement I could not yet determine, but whose individual weights I had begun, distinctly, to feel. Chapter 6. Silent Agreements. Evening came early, as it does in the north in January, and with it a resumption of the snow that had paused during the afternoon. I watched it from the library window while Holmes sat behind me in a state of apparent inactivity that I had long since stopped mistaking for idleness. He had not spoken for the better part of an hour. He had not moved from the chair. His pipe had gone out and he had not relit it. These were, in my experience, the signs of a man in the deepest phase of his work. I occupied myself with a volume I was not reading and waited. He spoke at last without preamble, as though continuing a conversation that had been proceeding in his head for some time, and had now reached a point at which a second participant was required. Nathaniel Crowe, he said, was not simply a local landowner who died in ambiguous circumstances. He was a man in possession of things that other men wished he did not possess. The question of what those things were has been answered partially by what I have observed today. The remaining portions will require some assistance from you. I set down my book. I want you, he continued, to speak with Miss Mercer this evening, not as an investigator, as a doctor, and as a man who was known to her uncle. She has something she wishes to say and has been waiting for a condition of privacy that has not yet presented itself. You can provide that condition more naturally than I can. I said that I would try, and asked what specifically he hoped she might tell me. Holmes rose from the chair and stood at the window beside me, looking out at the darkened garden. The clock tower, he said simply. Begin there. The opportunity came after dinner, when the company began its habitual dispersal, and Miss Mercer paused in the doorway of the drawing-room with the air of someone who has made a decision and is now committed to it. I offered to fetch her a second cup of tea from the sideboard, and she accepted, and when I returned she had taken the chair nearest the door rather than her usual place near the fire. It was the choice of a person who wants the option of departure. We spoke first of her uncle, and she received my expressions of condolence with a composure that was clearly costing her something. She had been, it emerged, closer to Sir Julian than the word niece quite conveyed. Her parents had died when she was 11, and Sir Julian had provided for her education, and eventually made Blackthorn Hall her permanent home. She spoke of this plainly, without sentiment, and I thought that whatever emotion she was managing had been managed for long enough that she had become practised at it. I asked, as naturally as I could, whether she had known Nathaniel Crowe. The change was not dramatic. She did not flinch or flush. She simply became, for a moment, very still, and then she looked at me with the directness of a woman who has decided that a question she has been dreading is, now that it has arrived, something of a relief. She had known him, she said, rather better, in fact, than anyone in the household was aware. What followed she told me in a low and level voice, and I shall record it as faithfully as I can, condensing only where the account repeated itself. Nathaniel Crowe had, for a period of nearly 2 years before his death, been engaged in a practice of quiet extortion. It was not conducted crudely. He had been an intelligent man. He had accumulated, over years of involvement in county affairs, a body of knowledge about the private lives and professional conduct of a number of local figures, and he had converted this knowledge, gradually, into a series of private arrangements under which those figures provided him with financial benefit in exchange for his continued silence. The arrangements were never acknowledged as what they were. They were framed as business considerations, as favours, as investments. Crowe had understood that the word blackmail spoken aloud creates a danger for the speaker as well as the subject. Among those subject to these arrangements, Miss Mercer told me, were Dr. Fawcett, whose conduct in a previous matter of a professional nature Crowe had discovered, Mr. Graves, whose handling of certain estate transactions had not survived close examination, and Captain Vale, whose military record contained a period of difficulty that Vale had spent considerable effort in obscuring. I asked about Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Mercer hesitated for the first time. Mrs. Whitmore, she said carefully, had been a close friend of Crowe's late wife, and had been a recipient of certain confidences which Crowe had subsequently attempted to use in ways that Mrs. Whitmore found intolerable. She did not elaborate further, and I did not press her. As for Hurst, she had not known of any direct connection between Hurst and Crow, but she said this with the slight qualification of someone who is not entirely certain what she does not know. I asked how she'd come to learn all of this. Her uncle, she said. Sir Julian had told her 3 days before our arrival, when the gravity of what he had found in the inquest records had become clear to him, and he had felt the need of a confidant. He had also told her one further thing, which she had debated with herself throughout our conversation, and which she now conveyed with the careful precision of someone repeating exact words. Sir Julian had told her that the anonymous letter, the letter which had set the whole matter in motion, had not been sent by a stranger. He believed he knew who had written it. He had not told her the name, but he had said that the writer was someone present in the house, and that the letter had been an act not of malice but of conscience, sent by a person who lacked the courage to speak directly, but could no longer bear silence. I brought this account to Holmes that night. He was in his room, standing at the small writing desk, and he listened without interrupting. When I had finished, he stood for a moment looking at the notes he had made during the day, which were arranged on the desk in a pattern I could not immediately interpret. "Good, Watson," he said. "That confirms the shape of it. The movements last night are now explicable in a general sense, if not yet individually assigned. At least 2 people in this household left their rooms after midnight. I had suspected as much. What Miss Mercer has told you explains why. Not conspiracy toward murder, but the rather more complicated conspiracy of mutual concealment. Several of these people have been protecting one another, and themselves, for months. Under that kind of pressure, a house becomes a place of very quiet activity." He paused, tapping the arrangement of notes with one finger. "The servant passages," he said. "I should like to examine them tomorrow before Mallory returns. There is a connecting corridor between the east wing and the stable block which I observed on our arrival, and which has not yet been mentioned by anyone. The absence of its mention is itself a mention of a kind." He looked up. "The clock tower has a room at its base. It has been used recently. The mortar around the door is disturbed, and there is a faint impression in the snow at its threshold, sheltered enough to have survived the second fall." He said nothing further. I returned to my room and lay awake for a time, assembling what I had learned and finding that it arranged itself not into a simple pattern but into something more complicated, a picture of several people, each carrying a private burden, drawn together by the death of a man who had made their burdens his instrument, and now gathered in a snowbound house where another death had occurred, and where the question of accident or design hung over everything like the weather itself. The snow outside my window was steady and without mercy, and Blackthorn Hall held its secrets as the season held its cold, completely, and with no immediate indication of relenting. Chapter 7. The Hidden Verdict. I have observed, across many years of accompanying Sherlock Holmes through the less navigable territories of human conduct, that his interest in a physical space intensifies in precise proportion to how thoroughly everyone else has ceased to think about it. The servant passages of Blackthorn Hall had been mentioned by nobody since our arrival, which Holmes considered, I knew, their most significant feature. We went before breakfast, while the household was in that interval of early morning which belongs to no one in particular. Holmes carried a small lantern from the hall table. I carried, with rather less certainty about its utility, the duplicate key that Hurst had produced 2 mornings earlier, and which Holmes had quietly retained. The entrance to the servant passage lay behind a door in the kitchen corridor, fitted with a simple iron latch, and opening onto a narrow staircase of stone that descended half a floor and then ran the length of the east wing in both directions. The passages were of the functional kind found in houses of this period and disposition, barely wide enough for 2 persons to pass, lit at intervals by small windows set high in the outer wall, smelling of cold stone and old plaster. They connected at their junctions to the various service areas of the house, and had presumably been used continuously until the household reduced itself to its present, more modest complement of staff. Holmes moved along the left-hand passage with the lantern held low, examining the stone floor in the manner of a man reading a text of which only certain passages remain legible. The dust along the margins of the passage had been disturbed at intervals, and at one point where the passage turned northward beneath what I calculated to be the approximate position of the study, there was a set of impressions in the dust sufficiently clear to indicate that two persons, at different times and almost certainly on different occasions, had passed this way recently. The impressions moved in both directions, which suggested journeys made and returned from rather than a single passage through. At the northern end of the passage, a door opened, with a duplicate key, onto a short external corridor connecting the main house to the stable block. The corridor was roofed but not enclosed at its sides below waist height, and the snow had drifted across its floor to a depth of several inches. Holmes set the lantern down and crouched over the drift. There were prints in it, or rather the ghosts of prints, partially filled by the overnight snowfall but not entirely obliterated. They indicated at least two separate journeys across the corridor toward the stable block, and one, possibly two, returns. The stride was consistent, in Holmes's estimate, with a man of the middle height moving with deliberate care rather than haste. The clock tower stood at the far corner of the stable block, a squat stone structure of perhaps 30 feet, its upper portion visible from several of the house windows. The door at its base was of heavy oak, fitted with a padlock that hung open on its staple, not locked. Holmes examined the hasp without touching it, and pointed out to me, without comment, that the screws which should have secured the staple to the door frame had been recently reseated. The wood around two of them was pale and freshly compressed, and a faint dusting of sawdust lay at the threshold. Inside, the lower room of the tower was small, cold, and almost empty. A lantern hook on the wall, a broken chair of indeterminate age, and a wooden box of the kind used for storing estate records stood against the far wall. The box was not locked. Holmes lifted its lid. Within it lay a document sealed in a manila envelope of recent manufacture. Holmes extracted it with gloved hands, a precaution I noted he had taken before we left the house, and opened it with care. I read it over his shoulder. It was, in form and presentation, a coroner's verdict. It bore the heading of the county court, the date of the original Crow inquest, and at its foot the signature of Dr. Edwin Fawcett above his printed designation. In content, however, it was entirely unlike the document we had examined in Sir Julian's study, where the official record had recorded a verdict of accidental death. This version stated, in the careful technical language of coroner's procedure, that the evidence did not support accidental death, and that the circumstances of Nathaniel Crow's end required further investigation by the appropriate authorities, with particular reference to parties present at the scene in the hours before his death. In the margin of the document, in handwriting I did not recognise, someone had written a single word: Graves. Holmes studied the document for rather longer than its length required. He resealed the envelope and replaced it with precision. We returned to the house in silence, and it was not until we had regained the main corridor and Holmes had closed the passage door behind us that he spoke. It was found too readily, he said. I said that on the contrary it had required some effort, and a detailed search of the grounds in difficult conditions. By us, Holmes said. Yes, but consider who placed it there. A man who wished to conceal a document does not place it in a box in an unlocked room in a structure visible from the house windows, accessible by a route through the servant passages that a child could follow in daylight. He buries it, or burns it, or removes it from the premises entirely. He paused. This document was not hidden. It was positioned. It was positioned in a place sufficiently obscure to survive casual discovery, but entirely accessible to a deliberate search. I asked what he concluded from this. That someone wished it found. Not immediately and not by accident, but in the course of an investigation, under circumstances in which its discovery would appear to be the resolution of the mystery. He looked at me steadily. The word Graves in the margin is not evidence. It is a direction. Someone is pointing, Watson, and pointing with considerable care. Inspector Mallory arrived mid-morning, stamping the snow from his boots in the entrance hall, with the energy of a man who has had a productive interval. He had received, it emerged, a communication from the county court overnight, forwarded through the local police station, a summary report from a clerk who had been asked, by parties unnamed, to review the condition of the sealed inquest record for the Crow matter, and who had found, upon examination, that the document currently held in the court's archive bore anomalies of paper stock and ink consistent with its being of more recent production than its stated date. The news moved through the household with the quiet, accelerating momentum of a stone released on a slope. Fawcett received it with a composure that had, I thought, the particular quality of a composure prepared in advance. Graves received it with an expression of grave concern that managed to be entirely unreadable. The others waited. Mallory, to his credit, understood immediately that the case had altered its nature, and he convened the household in the drawing-room that afternoon with a gravity proportional to the new situation. He spoke briefly and with care, and then announced that the investigation into Sir Julian's death was now to be considered, provisionally, as potentially connected to the matter of the inquest record. Holmes sat in his corner chair and said nothing. He had the expression he sometimes carries when events are moving in a direction he has anticipated but not yet chosen to redirect. Watchful, patient, and faintly dissatisfied with the pace. That evening, as the household sat in the drawing-room in the peculiar collective tension of people waiting for something to break, I observed Fawcett and Graves exchanging across the width of the room a glance of the kind that has no social function. It was brief, unremarkable to anyone who was not looking for it, and it settled into the record of the day alongside the hidden document, the disturbed passage, and the single marginal word, all of it accumulating toward a resolution that Holmes had not yet provided, and that I sensed, with the instinct of long experience, was nearer than the weather or the circumstances suggested. Outside the snow held, inside something was about to give way. Chapter 8. The Confession. It came the following morning, and it came in the way that such things tend to come when they have been prepared rather than spontaneous, at a moment of general assembling, when the audience was already present and needed only to be addressed. Hurst appeared in the doorway of the dining-room as breakfast was concluding. He was dressed with his usual neatness, but his face had the quality I had observed in men on the morning of a decision from which there is no returning. Resolved, pale, and almost peaceful, the way a fever breaks and leaves a man exhausted but clear. He asked, with a composure that cost him visibly, whether Inspector Mallory might be available for a private conversation. Mallory, who had spent the night at the local inn and arrived with the morning light, looked up from his cup and said that he was. The conversation was not, in the event, private. Hurst asked that it be conducted in the drawing-room with all present. This request, unexpected and carrying its own weight of significance, produced a general movement from the dining-room, and within a few minutes the household was arranged around the drawing-room in what had become, over the past several days, its habitual disposition. Graves and Fawcett in separate chairs near the window, Captain Vale standing, Mrs. Whitmore with her unapplied needlework, Miss Mercer to one side with her hands composed in her lap, and Holmes in the corner chair, crossed legs and downward gaze, the very image of a man who has temporarily withdrawn his attention. Hurst stood before the fire. He began without preamble. He told us that several months before the Crow inquest, he'd been approached by Crow himself. Crow had in his possession a letter written by Hurst to a young woman in the village, which was of a personal nature, and which Crow had represented would cause considerable distress to Sir Julian, who held old-fashioned views on such matters, if it were brought to his attention. The approach had been indirect and the threat unspoken, but Hurst had understood it entirely. He had been frightened, and in his fright he had agreed to a request which he recognised, even as he agreed, would not be the last. The request concerned the inquest documents. Crow, anticipating that his manner of living might eventually produce legal difficulties, had wanted assurance that certain materials passing through the coroner's office would be accessible to him in advance of any formal proceedings. Hurst had a connection to the court office through a clerical friend there, and the arrangement Crowe proposed was that Hurst would provide advance notice of any relevant documents. It was not, Hurst said, with a precision that suggested he had rehearsed this, a matter of altering anything, only of knowing. When Crowe died and the inquest proceeded, however, Hurst found himself in possession of something more consequential than advance notice. Through his contact, he had obtained sight of the draft verdict before it was finalised. The draft had used different language from what ultimately appeared in the sealed record. The alteration between draft and final had been small, a single word and its implications, but the direction of that alteration was unmistakable. Hurst had copied the draft and kept the copy. He had not known at the time what to do with it. When Sir Julian had begun his review of the inquest records and had shown Hurst some of what he was finding, Hurst had produced his copy and given it to Sir Julian. He had also, he said, written the anonymous letter. He had done it badly, he knew, without providing the direct information that would have made it properly useful, but he had been afraid of the consequences of naming himself as the source. Sir Julian had known immediately from the handwriting who had sent it, and had told Hurst so, without reproach. What followed in Hurst's account was the portion I found most difficult to hear, because it concerned the night of Sir Julian's death. He had gone to the study shortly before midnight. Sir Julian was at his desk examining the documents, and he was not, Hurst said with visible care, in good health. They had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes. Hurst had confirmed what Sir Julian had already largely understood, the nature of Crowe's arrangement with himself and the provenance of the draft. The conversation had been calm and Sir Julian had been grateful. When Hurst left, Sir Julian was alive and seated at his desk. Hurst had returned to his room through the servant passage. He had not locked the study door, which was to say that when he left it, it had been unlocked. He stopped there, and the room received the conclusion of his account in a silence of the particular quality that follows a statement which explains a great deal and yet does not explain everything. Mallory asked several precise questions, all of which Hurst answered without hesitation or elaboration. The question of the hidden document in the clock tower Hurst answered directly. He had placed it there, the previous afternoon, having recovered it from among Sir Julian's papers when it became apparent that the study would be searched. He had not wanted it destroyed, but he had not wanted Mallory to find it before he had decided how to proceed. The word Graves he had added himself, he said, because he believed it to be true. Mallory wrote steadily throughout this. The room was very quiet. I looked at Graves and found him looking at his hands. I looked at Fawcett and found him looking at nothing. I looked at Holmes. Holmes had not moved. His gaze had not lifted from the floor at the point approximately 4 feet before his chair upon which it had rested throughout. He might have been listening, or he might have been entirely elsewhere. I knew him well enough to know the difference, and he was entirely present. It was Mrs. Whitmore who spoke next, in a tone of gentle finality that seemed to close the matter. She said that the truth was evidently now established, and that she hoped the full account would reflect well upon Mr. Hurst's courage in coming forward. Captain Vale said nothing. Miss Mercer looked at Hurst with an expression that contained, I thought, both gratitude and something more complicated. Mallory announced that he would require formal statements and that the matter of Graves's involvement would need to be examined further. The gathering began to dissolve. I waited until the room had largely emptied, and then crossed to Holmes, who had not risen. He was looking now at the fire, and there was about him the stillness that I associated not with satisfaction, but with reservation, the particular quality he carries when events have moved as he anticipated, and in a direction he considers insufficient. "A compelling account," I said. "Admirably so," Holmes replied. He said it quietly, without edge, and yet the word admirably arrived, with a weight that was not quite the word's natural weight. He looked at me then, with the expression that serves him as a warning. Too admirably, Watson, constructed with exactly the right proportions of guilt and innocence, self-reproach and exculpation. Enough truth to withstand examination, and enough omission to redirect it. I said that I had found Hurst entirely convincing. So did everyone else, Holmes said. That is the single detail about his confession that I find most interesting. He rose from the chair at last and straightened his coat. Hurst is protecting someone. The person he is protecting does not deserve protection, and the document in the clock tower was placed there not by a frightened young secretary covering his tracks, but by a careful mind arranging a conclusion. He paused at the doorway. We are being managed, Watson, with considerable skill. I intend to stop being managed before tomorrow morning. He walked out into the corridor, and I stood for a moment in the empty drawing room with the fire burning and the snow pressing at the windows, feeling the ground shift beneath what I had believed until approximately 4 minutes ago to be a solved case. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the truth. Holmes did not sleep that night, or if he did, it was the brief functional sleep of a man who uses rest as a tool rather than a surrender. When I descended at 7 the following morning, he was already in the drawing room, standing before the mantelpiece with his back to the door and a sheet of paper in his hand covered in the dense, abbreviated notation that served him as a private language. The fire had been burning for some time. 3 other sheets lay on the small table beside his chair, each covered in the same manner, arranged in a sequence that meant something to him and nothing, at first inspection, to me. He turned when I entered, assessed my readiness to be useful, and told me to ask Mallory to assemble the household at 10 o'clock. I did not ask what he intended. I have learned, over many years, that Holmes at this stage of a case is not a man who benefits from questions. He has by this point assembled the mechanism entirely in his head, and he requires only the proper moment and the proper room in which to demonstrate it. Questions introduce an obligation to explain before the demonstration is complete, which violates a principle he holds as firmly as any other, that the truth, presented in the correct order, is more powerful than the truth presented at all once. Mallory received my message with the expression of a man who has dealt with Holmes before, only through reputation, but has been sufficiently warned. He convened the household without difficulty. They were all present at 10. Graves with the composed wariness of a man who has spent the night with his own thoughts and found them poor company. Fawcett, with a stillness that had by now become his most consistent characteristic. Captain Vale with his arms at his sides and his eyes on Holmes from the moment Holmes entered. Mrs. Whitmore in the chair she had occupied throughout the investigation, her hands in her lap, and her expression one of careful attention. Miss Mercer beside the window, her face composed but her fingers laced tightly together, and Hurst seated rather apart from the others, who looked not at Holmes but at the floor with the expression of a man who knows that a version of events he has constructed is about to be taken apart, and is measuring in advance what will remain. Holmes stood before the fire. He did not refer to his notes. He began without announcement or theatrical preparation, in the manner of a man resuming a conversation rather than initiating one. The difficulty with a carefully arranged deception, he said, is that its arrangement is itself a form of evidence. A room in which everything is in order is a room in which someone has put things in order, and the act of ordering leaves traces as surely as disorder does. I have spent 4 days examining traces. He began with the clock. The study clock, he said, had been stopped not by Sir Julian and not accidentally. It had been stopped deliberately at 20 minutes past 11, by a person who needed the household to believe that Sir Julian had died before midnight. The reason for this was specific. At midnight, or shortly after, something had occurred in or near the study which would become inexplicable if Sir Julian was known to have been alive at the time. By placing his death before midnight, the perpetrator eliminated an interval they could not otherwise account for. What had occurred at midnight, Holmes continued, was the entry of Lionel Graves into the study through the servant passage. He did not hurry past this. He allowed the name to settle. Graves's expression did not change. He looked at Holmes with the attention of a solicitor examining a document he intends to dispute. Holmes reconstructed the sequence with the methodical patience of a man who has thought it through many times and is now thinking it through aloud for the first and last time. Graves had known, through the particular professional intelligence of a solicitor who'd been involved in the management of several local estates, that Sir Julian had begun examining the Crow inquest records. He had also known, because Hurst had told him, that Sir Julian was in possession of the draft verdict, that he knew the verdict had been switched, and that he intended to act. What Hurst had not known was that Graves had been for some months the architect of the substitution. The forged verdict in the court archive was Graves's work, not Fawcett's. The alteration had served Graves's purposes. The suppressed verdict, had it stood, would have led to an inquiry into the circumstances of Crow's death, and that inquiry would in turn have led to an examination of the estate transactions surrounding Crow's land, transactions in which Graves had conducted himself in ways that bore no examination at all. Fawcett's role, Holmes said, had been the passive one of a man who accepted an alteration he did not make in exchange for the burial of a matter Crow had held over him. He had not forged, he had acquiesced. The ink on his cuffs the previous morning had come not from conducting paperwork, as he claimed, but from examining his own retained copies of the original inquest notes, which he had kept privately, and which he had been reading and rereading since our arrival, measuring his exposure. Graves had entered the study after midnight. Sir Julian had already been dead for perhaps an hour. The cardiac event that Watson's examination had indicated was genuine. Graves had not killed him. What Graves had done was arrive, find Sir Julian dead, and recognise with the speed of a quick and unscrupulous intelligence that the situation presented an opportunity. He had spent the better part of an hour in the study. He had altered the document's position. He had moved the chair. He had stopped the clock. He had taken the draft verdict from Sir Julian's desk, carried it to the clock tower room where he had previously established a private cache, placed it in a box with a handwritten notation designed to direct suspicion toward himself in the controlled manner of a man who controls the direction by controlling the discovery. He had locked the study door from the inside using the gap beneath it and a folded paper, a method that leaves no trace once the paper is withdrawn. Then he had walked back through the servant passage, leaving the impressions we found, and returned to his room. Hurst's confession, Holmes said, had been Graves's secondary arrangement. Hurst had genuinely been in the study before midnight, had genuinely left Sir Julian alive, had genuinely placed the clock tower document there after the fact, out of misguided protectiveness towards Sir Julian's reputation and his own. Graves had known all of this and had encouraged Hurst to confess, persuading him that a partial confession would satisfy Mallory and close the investigation. Hurst had not known he was being managed. He had believed he was doing the right thing by taking responsibility for the portions of the affair that were genuinely his. Holmes then looked directly at Hurst. He said it without reproach, and quietly, that Hurst's loyalty was not misplaced in its instinct, but had been exploited by a man who recognised a useful instrument when he found one. He looked at Graves. The thumb impression on the inquest document copy, Holmes said, is not Sir Julian's, as I observed 4 days ago. I have compared it with the impressions available from the objects you have handled in this room since our arrival. They are consistent. The paper stock of the document in the court archive is, as the clerk's report confirms, newer than its date. You sourced it, Graves. The estate transactions surrounding Crow's land will, when examined by the appropriate authorities, confirm the rest. The room was entirely silent. Outside, for the first time in 5 days, I could hear birdsong, thin and distant, which meant the snow had stopped and the temperature had shifted. Graves sat for a long moment without speaking. When he did speak, it was with the tone of a man who is rapidly recalibrating rather than conceding, and he had begun to say that he wished to consult legal counsel before making any statement. Holmes said that this seemed entirely reasonable and looked at Mallory. Mallory, who had been writing throughout, set down his pencil. Chapter 10. The snow begins to melt. By noon the thaw was unmistakable. Water ran in thin lines from the roof of the stable block and fell into the snow below, with a sound that was, after so many days of absolute silence, almost startling. The carriage drive, invisible since our arrival, began to reassert itself in dark patches through the white, and the oaks along its margins shed small avalanches from their upper branches at intervals, as though the trees were gradually recovering the ability to move. Graves was taken to the local constabulary before luncheon, accompanied by Mallory and the constable, who had been a steady, reliable presence throughout the investigation, without ever, so far as I observed, forming an independent opinion about anything. Graves walked to the waiting vehicle with the composure of a man who has already begun, in his head, the process of constructing a legal defence, and who is marshalling his resources rather than experiencing a situation. I watched from the window of the entrance hall. Holmes stood beside me for a moment, then turned away before the vehicle had fully departed, which told me all I needed to know about his interest in that particular aspect of the conclusion. The afternoon was given over to the particular subdued activity that follows the resolution of something that has held a household in suspension. Statements were completed and signed. Mallory returned and spent an hour with Holmes in the study, during which I understood that the full reconstruction was being formally recorded for the purposes of the county investigation. The estate transactions surrounding Crow's land were, as Holmes had indicated, to become a matter of separate and extended inquiry. And it was that inquiry, rather than anything that had occurred at Blackthorn Hall, that would likely constitute the central matter of Graves's legal difficulties. Fawcett sought me out in the late afternoon. He found me in the library, where I had retreated less from a desire to read than from a desire to be somewhere quiet, and he stood for a moment in the doorway before entering, which is the gesture of a man who is uncertain of his reception and has decided to risk it anyway. He said that he wished me to know, because I was a medical man, and he believed I would understand the distinction, that the alteration of the inquest verdict had not originated with him, had not been his suggestion, and had not, in the final analysis, served any interest of his beyond the temporary suppression of something Crow had used against him. He had been afraid, and fear had made him compliant where he should have been resolute, and he was not asking to be excused for this, but only to have it understood accurately. I told him that I thought it would be understood accurately, and that Holmes's reconstruction had made the distinction between his role and Graves's as clear as the circumstances permitted. He nodded once, briefly, and left without further elaboration. I thought about him for some time afterward. A competent professional man who had spent months living with the knowledge of what he had allowed, and who had come to Blackthorn Hall carrying that knowledge while sitting at the same table as the man who had arranged it. It was not a comfortable meditation, but I found it difficult to summon the straightforward condemnation that might have been easier. Hurst that I found in the estate office, where he had returned with the quiet industriousness of a man who does not know what else to do with himself, and has decided that work is the nearest available equivalent to stability. He looked up when I entered, and then looked back at the papers before him, and I had the impression of someone who is uncertain what his situation now is and is waiting to be told. I told him what I believed to be true, that his position in Holmes's reconstruction was that of a man who had made poor choices under significant pressure, had attempted to protect Sir Julian when protection mattered, and had been subsequently used by a more calculating mind for purposes he had not understood. Whether the authorities would view this with the leniency it perhaps merited was not something I could predict, but I did not think he would find Holmes's account of him an unkind one. He thanked me with a restraint that I respected, and returned to his papers. Holmes and I dined alone that evening, the rest of the household having arranged private suppers or retired early, from a collective exhaustion that was as much emotional as physical. The dining room felt larger than it had at any point during the week, the table set for two at one end of its considerable length, candles lit and the snowlight fading outside the windows. Holmes ate with more appetite than he had shown since our arrival, which is always, in my experience, an indication that a case has reached its terminus in his mind and released the attention that had been consuming everything else. I asked him the question I had been waiting to ask since the drawing room that morning. "The anonymous letter," I said. "You told me yesterday that Hurst had admitted to writing it, and the account he gave in his confession confirmed as much. But you have never said whether you believed, before he admitted it, who had sent it." Holmes looked at me over his wine glass with the expression he occasionally produces when a question pleases him without surprising him. "I knew it was Hurst from the third day," he said. The handwriting on the clock tower document matched characteristics visible in the estate ledgers he had completed. More to the point, the letter's phrasing was that of a man with legal training insufficient to constitute genuine expertise, but sufficient to produce the language of careful qualification. A secretary who has spent 4 years with a magistrate writes that way. He cannot help it. I asked whether there was anything in the case that had given him genuine difficulty. He considered this with the seriousness he extends to honest questions. "The lamp angle," he said at length. "There was a period of approximately 1 day during which I could not determine whether it had been adjusted by Graves during his midnight visit or by Sir Julian himself earlier in the evening. If it had been Sir Julian's adjustment, a portion of my reconstruction collapsed. It was the thumb impression that settled it. Graves had handled the lamp. The oil on his right thumb from the lamp mechanism was present on the document he subsequently moved." He paused. "A single unresolved detail is, in my experience, more productive than a complete account. It keeps the attention from settling prematurely." We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the sound of water was constant now, the thaw working through the packed snow with the patient thoroughness of a process that cannot be accelerated or deferred. I asked finally whether he thought the resolution just. He set his glass down and looked at the candle. "Graves will be examined for the estate transactions and will find that the law, when it arrives at him through that route, is considerably less escapable than he currently believes. Fawcett will lose his standing and may lose his position. Whether he loses more than that is not mine to determine. Hurst acted badly and then well, and the proportions of each will be weighed by people with the appropriate authority." He looked up. "Sir Julian died of his heart, Watson, in the course of doing the thing he had spent 40 years doing, examining irregularities until they became explicable. That is not the worst way for such a man to end." We finished our meal in a silence that was, by this point, companionable rather than heavy. The roads were reopened the following morning. Our bags were brought down by the manservant who had met us at the door what felt like a great deal more than a week ago, and Holmes and I stood for a moment on the front steps of Blackthorn Hall in a cold that was perceptibly less absolute than it had been. The sky a pale, washed blue above the white valley floor. Holmes pulled on his gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man returning to the world from which he's been temporarily absent. He looked out at the carriage drive where the oaks were dripping steadily and the surface was visible in long, irregular patches beneath the melting snow. "Most men observe events, Watson," he said. "The detective observes sequence. When one understands not merely what occurred, but precisely when and in what order, impossibilities vanish and truth remains." He descended the steps before I could reply, which I have come to understand is not rudeness, but simply the habit of a man for whom the last word is less important than the next problem, and I followed him down the drive toward the road, leaving Blackthorn Hall to its silence and its thaw, and the long, slow work of recovering from what the winter had deposited within it. I recorded the affair in my notes that evening, on the return journey south, and I have thought of it many times since. Not primarily as a demonstration of Holmes's method, though it was that, but as a reminder that the most dangerous forms of deception are those constructed not from false materials, but from true ones, arranged by a careful hand into a shape that points somewhere other than the truth. Graves had used real documents, real events, real fears, and real loyalties, and had trusted that the pattern he imposed upon them would be the pattern everyone saw. He had not, in the end, accounted sufficiently for the one observer in Blackthorn Hall who looked not at patterns but at sequence, and who had learned by long practice that the order in which things occur is the most honest testimony the world provides.